In the wake of the devastation caused by Hurricane Helene, one heartbreaking image went viral. It showed a young girl, maybe 4 to 5 years old, drenched, wearing a life jacket. She was sitting in what looked like the bow of a boat in the midst of floodwaters, terrified and clutching an equally soaked puppy. The picture captured the sense of suffering by the most vulnerable and was used with a number of reports about the devastation. Because the image was so poignant, it also evoked anger in people when it was used with false reports claiming that FEMA was not helping because they'd given all their money away to migrants, or that a government led by Democrats wouldn't help those suffering in Republican-leaning areas. All of the accusations were easily disproven lies, but paired with a powerful image, people believed them. And the image, which under normal circumstances would move people to compassion and a desire to help, began to represent anger and distrust of the very people who were working round the clock to help them. But it's worse than that. As it turns out, not only were those reports totally fabricated, the image itself was fake. It was an AI-generated image. There was no such girl. It wasn't even staged. No such girl, no such puppy. AI-generated image, crafted to evoke maximum compassion that could, once paired with a false narrative, be twisted into maximum outrage for political gain. There were, of course, actual images of devastation and suffering that could have been used, but real images are inconvenient for those seeking to deceive. In a real photograph, the locations can be identified, people in them can be named, found, interviewed by journalists who could report and broadcast the truth about the all-out efforts to help, contradicting the false narrative that was the whole point. Made-up stories need made-up images to go with them. No fact-checking allowed. The world has changed in many troubling ways across the past decade, and many difficult problems not only remain unsolved, but seem further away from resolution than ever, even as the consequences of letting them run unfettered grow more dire. From the climate crisis to the border, from health care to deficits, from education to housing to our system of justice, the consequences of ignoring any of them and failing to see how together they make every individual issue worse pose existential threats to our children, our grandchildren, and to all future generations. For all of 2024, we have been exploring the kinds of choices we have and all the biblical and theological foundations for making tough decisions. From now through Thanksgiving, we're going to look at the truly massive issues rocking our nation and world and the choices that we can make, both as individuals and a church related to them. It's easy to be overwhelmed by any one of those issues. They're all so large and complex. But as I thought about the fake image of the girl and the deliberately false information about the response to Hurricane Helene, something clicked. Last Wednesday night, as coverage of Hurricane Milton was interspersed with news of bonkers conspiracy theories, accusing meteorologists of controlling the weather on behalf of the government and directing hurricanes at red states, all accompanied by very real death threats and calls to bomb Doppler radar equipment, I was making notes about this sermon into the night. The first week of the series today is focused on the issues facing our planet. Scientists have been screaming into the void for half a century about the dangers our lifestyle presents to the earth, especially in developed nations. By the 1970s, Exxon was doing unprecedented levels of quality research into the effects of fossil fuels on the climate. In 1978, J.F. Black, one of Exxon's top researchers, sent an internal memo to Exxon's board of directors with the result of his latest study, which is available for anybody to look up and read online. At the end of the summary of his research, Dr. Black writes, quote, "Present thinking holds that man has a time window of 5 to 10 years before the need for hard decisions regarding changes in energy strategies might become critical," close quote. Again, that's 1978, the date of that memo. By the end of the 1980s, which was Dr. Black's deadline for making those hard decisions, Exxon had instead begun funding efforts to discredit and deny what their own researchers had spent 2 decades proving. They pushed climate change denial not only here, but internationally. They knew the dangers, just like Philip Morris knew the dangers of smoking. And like Philip Morris before them, Exxon lied to keep their profits flowing. The current insanity is new in its brazenness and violence, not to mention the level of cuckoo in its claims. I mean, flat earthers, you can take a seat, someone else has taken over. But the current state of affairs is merely the cumulative effect of almost 50 years of well-funded efforts to deny scientific consensus and buy the silence and complicity of those who might challenge those denials, most especially those who might legislate in ways that would cut into corporate profits. The weather was not initially a political football until the money rolled into campaign coffers and the courts allowed those donations to remain hidden, which happened in the Citizens United decision by the US Supreme Court in 2010. One of the most insightful statements I've ever heard comes from Dr. Amos Wilson, a 20th century African-American professor of psychology at the City University of New York. He said, quote, "If you want to understand any problem in America, you need to focus on who profits from that problem, not who suffers from that problem." Wednesday night, as I thought about the fake image of the girl and people wanting to bomb radar stations, I remembered Dr. Wilson's wisdom and came to realize that we have largely focused on the wrong parts of the problems, not just the climate problem, but all of them. We try to approach problems by calling on human compassion for those who suffer the most from them. That suffering is real and tragic and preventable, which is part of what stokes our outrage and feelings of helplessness. But Dr. Wilson's words rang in my ears. The root of the problem is not found by looking at who suffers from it, but by looking at who profits from not solving it. And ironically, that made me hopeful. The thing turning thorny problems into existential crises is not a failure of science or innovation or even financial resources. The root of every problem we face is spiritual. It is moral failure. It is sin. Greed, lies, corruption, cruelty, the lust for power, celebrity, and fame, the desire to make God in our own image, our old friend idolatry, to enhance ourselves at the expense of others. Saving the earth won't be accomplished by teaching more people about the effects of carbon in the atmosphere, or creating more graphs to show how the burning of fossil fuels makes all that worse, as true as that is. That's been evident to everybody willing to listen for half a century. We do learn more about all that with every passing day, especially as we enter into the uncharted territory predicted decades ago, as we have. But lack of information is not why we can't solve the problem. We can't solve the problem because huge corporations, individual billionaires, and nation states with fossil fuels to sell profit from the problem. And those entities pass some of their profit along to those in positions of influence to make sure that those profits stay in place. If money doesn't stop the problem solvers, well, fear tactics might, or blackmail. Being targeted with legal action might get problem solvers to back down, maybe threats to their families, huge IRS audits. Or they can be chased out of their influential positions by armies of bots and trolls, which cost almost nothing for a pretty great return for those spending the money. Billionaires can take over and destroy effective communication tools. We see daily the advice of Steve Bannon being followed to, quote, just flood the zone with a word that rhymes with bit. The problem is not ignorance, although that's an intentional tactic by those paid to make sure problems are not solved. The problem is corruption and cowardice. The problem is sin. I can't blame you if you're wondering why focusing on corruption and moral decay would make me feel more hopeful about all of these issues. After all, they have been allowed and in some cases actively encouraged to burrow into every institution in our society, including in the church. But while the church is not in the best position to teach science, develop technology, or work out the intricacies of complex policy decisions, sin is directly in the church's wheelhouse. If the root of the problem is corruption and idolatry, the worship of money, power, celebrity, and fame, then the church has had all the tools needed to address the problem since Moses. The church has no business wringing our hands and saying, oh dear, what can we do about the climate or any one of these other problems? We are supposed to bear the good news that serves as an antidote to corruption and moral decay. We serve the one who said, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free, who even said, I am the truth. Tell me, which of the 7 deadly sins is not compounding the climate crisis and preventing solutions? Lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, envy, pride? While all of us are flawed, at the very least, we can stop electing and idolizing people who wear those sins as badges of honor. The church has a role to play, not only in calling out the blatant idolatry and corruption of our time, but by instilling in current and in future generations the values that can make people more resistant to the bribe, less vulnerable to deception, and more willing to give their lives in service to the world rather than themselves. Importantly, we're commanded to do that work the way Jesus did, through teaching and through our own example, not by taking over the government and forcing God's laws down the throats of others. Jesus showed us the way God wants us to use our power and influence. He tied a towel around his waist and he washed the feet of even those who were about to betray him. We would not be in the predicament we are in today without the complicity and silence of the church. But that also means that if the church should refuse to continue that complicity, if we learn once again that Jesus identifies himself with the truth, and that the very first of the 10 commandments is to have no other gods. We don't need them in schools and courtrooms. We need those things posted in the church. We can begin to reverse the damage. Tell me which of the monumental problems we face couldn't be solved if we did the one thing Jesus said was necessary for eternal life, to love God and our neighbors as ourselves. Doing that wouldn't make thorny issues suddenly easy. The problems were difficult to solve before the corruption kicked in to prevent those solutions. But it would make solving them possible. In 1962, Rachel Carson, a nature writer and former marine biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, wrote a book called Silent Spring. The book was focused on the environmental destruction caused by the pesticide DDT. She had been researching the problems with DDT for years, but was spurred to write the book by a letter from a person living here in Massachusetts on Cape Cod, who was distressed by the massive number of bird deaths in areas where the pesticide was used. The chemical industry fought back hard against her claims, but Dr. Carson had anticipated that pushback and filled her book with so much scientific evidence and support that it convinced the U.S. government to take action. As the book became a bestseller, people took notice, not just of DDT, but of the damage of oil spills and logging and other aspects of our lifestyle that were harming the earth and all creatures, human and non, who lived on it. On April 22nd, 1970, the first Earth Day was celebrated by 20 million people across the United States. How do you remember that? I was there. That led to the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency that following December, and then to the Clean Water Act of 1972. Ah, the days of innocence. The days when a book of facts about the natural world people loved could be recognized as valid, and denials by companies like Monsanto, who obviously stood to profit from the continued use of the DDT that they sold, had their denials judged for what they were, a calloused willingness to kill the earth for money. People mobilized quickly to create solutions, while those who profited from the problems also mobilized behind the scenes to stop them. Monsanto was still at it, only with Roundup this time. Philip Morris is still in business, despite its blatant lies, even under oath before Congress, about the dangers of smoking. Exxon is still at it, despite all the exposure of its lies about the impact of fossil fuels as revealed by its own scientists. It's taken 50 years to corrupt enough people and enough institutions to allow those with enough money to simply dismiss not only experts and thousands of peer-reviewed studies, but the plain evidence of what we see and feel every day. Now, all they have to do is stick a political label on it, make people fight with people that they've been trained to hate, even if they're family members, and call it just another profitable day. Every day we fight with each other is another day spent not solving the problem, which suits those who profit from the problem just fine, and it's much cheaper to keep going. The distractions, lies, extortion, and deeply entrenched corruption currently blocking those solutions is a spiritual problem, a moral problem, a problem that the Bible has illustrated for us with both warnings and remedies for thousands of years. For all its faults and failures, the corruption within religious institutions themselves, the church exists to remind people what it takes for everything that God has made to flourish, and what it means to love our neighbors as ourselves. If we didn't have the means to help move these problems to resolution, nobody would have seen the need to corrupt us. The passage from Jeremiah that Kim read earlier is one of the more famous stories in the Bible. As the Babylonians are poised to take over Jerusalem and the king has refused to listen to the advice God gave him through the prophet Jeremiah, things look bleak, and they are. The Babylonians not only take Jerusalem shortly after that writing, they burn it to the ground after a cruel siege that has the starving people resorting to eating their dead. Jeremiah knew horror was coming as the people refused to listen to the voice of God. But instead of wailing in sackcloth and ashes, or doing like the other prophets did and just tell the king whatever he wanted to hear, Jeremiah went out and bought a field in the very land that he knew would soon be overtaken and burned. The siege was already beginning. Why? Because God told him to. Because buying the piece of land was a sign that the horrors to come would eventually end. And as God says in verse 15, houses and fields and vineyards will again be bought and sold in this land. Jeremiah's purchase was not a panacea. Plenty of people didn't survive the siege, let alone return to the land from exile some 70 years later. And Jeremiah himself is believed to have died in Egypt, not on the parcel of land that he bought in Judah. But what God asked of prophets was that they bring God's message to the people, not just with words, but with physical signs, sometimes objects, sometimes physical actions, to be a tangible reminder of the message and God's promise when difficult times raged. In this case, Jeremiah put his money where his mouth was. He invested in the land to encourage people and to keep hope alive through dire circumstances. We can do the same. Across these 7 weeks, as we consider the challenges we face and the future generations that will be affected by our choices, we will also be asking you to consider your annual financial pledge to Crawford for 2025, as well as a separate 3-year commitment specifically for investment in our physical property. Here, during our 100th anniversary of the building of this sanctuary, took place between 1923 and 1926, right in the middle of it. Each week, as we look at the most intractable problems we face, we'll also look at what it might look like for Crawford to have physical expressions of our hope in God and our commitment to work for a better world. For example, one of the things your donations to our regular operating budget provides is the actual coffee for coffee hour. You donate the snacks, we provide the coffee. For decades, we have bought fair trade coffee to signify our commitment to supporting corporations who pay farmers a living wage, even though fair trade coffee costs us a bit more. Recently, the Smithsonian Institute has added another kind of certification, in this case for bird-friendly coffee. Coffee that not only gives more profit back to actual farmers, but that's also shade-grown. Growing coffee in the shade adds 10 years to the life of every coffee plant, provides genetic diversity in the trees used to shade the coffee, and replenishes the devastated bird habitats in the global south where most of the coffee is grown. The added birds eat the pests on the coffee plants, saving money for growers and avoiding the use of harmful pesticides, which would otherwise make their way into the food chain. You will be able to sample bird-friendly coffee at coffee hour this morning. With a bit more to our operating budget next year, we could serve coffee that is organic, fair trade, and bird-friendly. Birders, listen up. With an added pledge to our capital needs, we could add air conditioning to the church, enabling us to serve the community as an emergency cooling center in a heat wave, and preparing us for the day when a heat dome sits on Winchester, like it already does in so many other parts of the country. And we find ourselves worshiping back on Zoom because it's too darn hot to worship either in the sanctuary or outside. We could upgrade our electrical service so that we could take advantage of programs that would allow us to install free EV charging stations in our parking lot. That's available to us now, but our electrical system can't handle it. That would provide a visible sign to all who pass by of our commitment to care for the earth. as well as a service to the community. Let our commitment to truth be the word, and our property convey the sign that Crawford is invested not just in ourselves, but in the presence of God in this place and in a just and habitable planet for future generations. Amen.